The Walking Dead has 8 major leaders across its entire run, and every single one of them is a complete disaster in their own special way. From a sheriff's deputy who keeps rewriting his own moral code, to a guy who walks around with a pet tiger pretending to be a king, today I'm breaking down every leader in The Walking Dead and what made each of them tick, starting with the one everybody already knows, Rick Grimes. Rick Grimes is a cop who wakes up from a coma, discovers the entire world is ended, and somehow decides that's his problem to fix, which is, a very specific personality type. Before you dismiss him as just another action hero with a gun and a moral compass, hear me out. What makes Rick interesting isn't that he's the strongest or the most ruthless. It's that he's the guy everyone defaults to when everything falls apart, and he has absolutely zero idea what he's doing half the time. He starts as a King County sheriff's deputy with a very clear worldview. Law is law. You protect people. You don't kill the living. And to his credit, he actually tries to live by that. He escapes a tank surrounded by walkers in downtown Atlanta, navigates back to his family, and earns the group's trust through sheer competence while Shane is busy losing his mind over Lori. Rick doesn't intimidate people into following him. He just keeps being right when it matters. But here's where it gets complicated. The world keeps punishing him for having principles. The governor shows up, and Rick tries diplomacy. It costs him Hershel's head and the entire prison. He withheld Dr. Jenner's infection revelation from his own group. He executed Pete without a trial. He slaughtered the Terminus cannibals in a church like it was a Tuesday afternoon. Every time he frames it as protecting civilization. Every time the line between that and personal dominance gets thinner. His moral compass flipped so many times over 9 seasons that tracking it requires a spreadsheet. Season 1. Rick would be horrified by Season 5 Rick. Season 5 Rick would think Season 1 Rick was going to get everyone killed. Both of them would be right. But here's the thing. When Rick finally wins the war against the Saviors, when Negan is on his knees bleeding out, Rick spares him. He tells everyone that the rule of law, not personal revenge, will be how they do things going forward. Maggie is furious. Half the audience is furious. But Rick doesn't care because he's not building a gang. He's building a civilization. And that's what separates him from everyone else on this list. He's not the strongest, the smartest, or the most consistent, but he's the one who keeps choosing to rebuild instead of just survive. But if you think Rick had it rough trying to hold on to his principles, wait until you meet the guy who built an entire kingdom on a performance, Ezekiel Sutton. Let's talk about the guy who showed up to the apocalypse dressed like a Renaissance fair headliner with a full-grown Bengal tiger and somehow made it work. Ezekiel Sutton was a zookeeper. That's it. That's the origin story. Before the world ended, this man's primary skill set was feeding animals on a schedule and making sure nobody climbed into the gorilla enclosure. But when civilization collapsed, he rescued a tiger named Shiva from the zoo, started speaking in Shakespearean monologues, draped himself in a royal costume, and convinced an entire community of survivors that he was their king. And the thing is, they knew. His people understood the act. They chose him anyway. That's the part nobody talks about enough. The kingdom was one of the only communities in the entire franchise where citizens followed their leader out of genuine admiration rather than fear. No iron, no bat, no pike border. Just a guy in a costume with a big cat and a bigger vocabulary, offering people something every other leader forgot to give them: dignity. Ezekiel understood that survival alone isn't enough. People need a story. And his story was that they weren't desperate refugees eating canned beans in a gymnasium. They were citizens of a kingdom. But here's where it gets interesting. When the war with the Saviors kicked off, Ezekiel proved his crown was a tool, not an identity. He stepped down to serve as one of 4 co-leaders of the militia alongside Rick, Maggie, and Cindy. No ego, no territorial posturing. Most leaders in this show would rather die than share power. Ezekiel handed it over like it was a library book. And then the Saviors took everything from him. He led his fighters into an offensive that ended in a devastating ambush. Nearly all of his combat-capable people wiped out in minutes. And when the walkers closed in, Shiva threw herself between them and certain death, saving Ezekiel, Jerry, and Carol at the cost of her own life. The tiger that built a kingdom, gone. Without Shiva, the costume was just fabric. What followed was a slow, quiet collapse. The kingdom fell apart. His marriage to Carol ended. He was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. There was a moment where he considered not fighting anymore, which is, not ideal, but he came back, not as a king this time, as a public servant. After Pamela Milton's regime crumbled, Ezekiel was elected governor of the Commonwealth. Elected, not crowned, not self-appointed, not installed by force. He ends the series not in a grave, not in exile, but in an office. Proof that kindness and competence aren't mutually exclusive, even in a world that punishes both at every opportunity. But if Ezekiel earned his leadership through warmth warmth and theater. The next leader on this list earned hers through something far more painful. Maggie Rhee. Maggie Rhee didn't climb a political ladder. There wasn't one. She built it from scratch while grieving the most public, most humiliating murder in the entire series. And that combination, builder and widow, is what makes her one of the most fascinating leaders The Walking Dead ever produced. When we first meet Maggie, she's Herschel Green's farm daughter, sheltered, protected. But the apocalypse has a way of finding people who are quietly competent, and Maggie turned out to be terrifyingly good at survival. By the time Rick's group reaches the hilltop, the place is being run by Gregory, a man whose entire leadership philosophy was, please don't hurt me, I'll give you whatever you want. He collaborated with the Saviors, sold his own people out, and literally tried to have Maggie assassinated. She displaced him not through a coup, but through the radical act of just being better at the job. The hilltop watched a coward negotiate their slavery, and a pregnant widow organize their defense. The math was not complicated, but Maggie's leadership was never just about competence. It was about Glenn. Negan beat Glenn to death with a baseball bat in front of her, and that moment became the foundation of everything she did afterward. Every decision, every alliance, every refusal to compromise was filtered through one question. Will this prevent what happened to Glenn from happening again? That's not strategy. That's theology. The sharpest example is Gregory's execution. After his assassination attempt failed, Maggie had him hanged at the hilltop gates, publicly, in front of children. That decision was simultaneously the most ruthless and the most stabilizing thing she ever did. Hanging him sent an unmistakable message. Betray this community and you die. The hilltop got safer overnight. The price was a woman standing over a swinging body and calling it justice. Whether those two things are different is a question the show never fully answers, which is, not ideal. Her real fracture comes with Rick. After the war, Rick spares Negan, keeps him alive, builds a new world on mercy, and Maggie looks at that decision like it's a personal insult, because to her, Negan breathing is not a moral achievement. It's a strategic liability and an active affront to every person he murdered. She's not wrong, but she's not entirely right either, and that tension between justified trauma and forward-looking leadership is the engine of her entire arc. Then Dead City happens, and suddenly, she's working alongside the man who killed her husband, protecting her son Herschel, making compromises she would have executed Gregory for. Her moral pragmatism stays completely unresolved, and that's exactly what makes her compelling. She's the series' most honest portrait of what grief does to leadership, a woman whose moral compass points unerringly toward the past, even when the present demands she look somewhere else. But if you think Maggie's complicated relationship with justice is messy, wait until you meet the man who made it that way, Negan Smith. Here's the uncomfortable question nobody wants to sit with. Was Negan wrong? Not morally. Morally, the guy beat two people to death with a baseball bat in front of their friends and family. That's not a gray area. But strategically, as a system of governance in a world where everyone is one bad Tuesday away from getting eaten alive, his argument holds up better than most people want to admit. Negan took over the sanctuary and rebranded the entire operation, called them the Saviors, not as a joke. He genuinely believed that's what they were doing, collecting tribute from communities that would otherwise tear themselves apart or get overrun. It was a protection racket, absolutely, but it was also a functioning multi-settlement government with supply chains, labor specialization, and rules that applied to everyone, including his own people. That's what separates him from the governor. Negan had a code. Rape was punishable by death among the Saviors. Break the rules, you get the iron to your face, doesn't matter who you are. The system was brutal, but it was consistent, which is, not ideal, but it's more than most apocalypse leaders managed. Then there's Lucille, the Bat, the entire Season 7 premiere where he lines up Rick's group, cracks jokes, and then caves in Abraham's head followed by Glenn's. That wasn't rage, that was theater. Every swing was a calculated message designed to break resistance without waging full-scale war. Kill two, traumatize everyone, and the other communities fall in line for months. It's monstrous. It also mathematically results in fewer total deaths than prolonged conflict. He'd be the first to tell you that. And the worst part is, he's not entirely wrong. But here's where it gets complicated. Rick slashes his throat, then saves his life, puts him in a cell for years. And somehow that cell actually changes him. Not into a good person, let's be clear. Into a person capable of something other than dominance. He saves Judith from a snowstorm. No audience, no angle, just a man carrying a kid through the cold because she'll die if he doesn't. Later, Carol recruits him to infiltrate Alpha's group, the single most dangerous assignment anyone's been handed in the entire series. He gains Alpha's trust, walks among people who wear human skin as casual Friday attire, and when the moment comes, he slits her throat and cuts off her head. Killing the most ideologically extreme leader the franchise ever produced earns him a pardon and exile. Then Dead City drags him right back into Maggie's orbit, because of course it does. Glenn's death sits between them like a third character in every scene. She can't forgive him. He can't undo it. They need each other anyway. Negan isn't a villain who became a hero. He's a genuinely monstrous person who turned out to also be capable of growth, which is somehow worse, because it means the monster was always a choice. But if Negan represents what happens when a leader goes too far and then tries to come back, the next guy never got the chance to try, because Shane Walsh was dead before the world even figured out what it was becoming. Shane Walsh is one of the most tragic characters in the entire Walking Dead universe, because he's not wrong, he's just broken. Before Rick Grimes ever woke up from that coma, Shane was the one keeping people alive. He organized the Atlanta Survivor Camp, ran patrols, rationed supplies, handled weapons training, and made the kind of fast, ugly decisions that kept a group of terrified civilians from getting eaten in the first week. While everyone else was still processing the end of the world, Shane was already operating like it had been over for months. He took Lori and Carl under his protection because he genuinely believed his best friend was dead in that hospital. Not dying, dead. He'd gone back. He'd listened at the door. The monitors were off. The hallways were filling with military gunfire, and Shane made the call that Rick was gone. And for a while, that worked. He had a purpose. He had a family. He had a role that made sense in a world where nothing else did. Then Rick came back, and every single piece of that identity collapsed overnight. Shane Walsh. Here's what nobody talks about with Shane. His entire psychology runs on a 5-stage loop, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Stage 1, relative calm. Shane's fine. He's functional, maybe even helpful. He'll teach people to shoot. He'll keep watch. He'll crack a joke around the fire like a normal human being. Stage 2, conflict shows up. Could be physical, could be emotional, could be Rick making a decision Shane thinks is soft. Stage 3, he stews. He gets snappy, irritable, desperate. He starts rubbing his head, pacing, picking fights over nothing. He's not dangerous yet, but he's circling the drain. Stage 4, Lori. Every single time, the trigger that pushes him past the point of no return is something connected to Lori, or Carl, or the family he's already lost. A glance, a rejection, Carl calling Rick dad a little too loud. And stage 5, explosive, poorly calculated retaliation. That's not villainy. That's a system failure with a predictable output. You can literally map this onto every major Shane incident in the show. The Otis situation at the school? Shane was calm. Then the mission went sideways. Then he realized he might not make it back to Lori and Carl, and then he sacrificed Otis without hesitation. The barn full of walkers at the farm? Same cycle. Rick wants to wait. Shane stews. Lori's pregnant, and the group is sitting around doing nothing. Shane snaps, grabs a shotgun, and rips those barn doors open because in his head, every second of inaction is a second closer to losing the only people he cares about. And the thing is, in between those explosions, Shane is genuinely good at surviving. He's arguably the first person in the group to understand what the new world actually requires. Rick spends half of season 2 trying to negotiate, compromise, and hold on to the moral framework of a civilization that no longer exists. Shane's already past that. He's operating on pure threat assessment. The tragedy isn't that he's wrong about the world. It's that being right about the world doesn't make you right about everything else. And Shane never figures out where that line is. He dies still believing he was the better man for the job. And honestly, parts of the audience never stopped agreeing with him. Philip the Governor Blake. Woodbury looked like civilization. Walls, electricity, hot meals, people walking around like the world hadn't ended. And that was the point. Philip Blake, the governor, built the single most convincing illusion of safety in the entire Walking Dead universe. He gave speeches. He smiled. He called people by their first names and made them feel like everything was going to be okay. And almost nobody questioned it, because why would you? The guy had running water. But here's where it gets complicated. The governor wasn't just pretending to be a good leader. He was genuinely good at it. Woodbury functioned. People had jobs, routines, something that resembled normal life. And at the center of all of it was his masterpiece, the Woodbury Arena. Staged fights between humans, ringed by chained walkers, performed as public entertainment. He took the thing everyone was most afraid of, the dead, and turned them into a spectacle. Background decoration at a sporting event. That's not just entertainment. That's psychological warfare against fear itself. He was teaching his people to look at walkers and feel powerful instead of terrified, which is, genuinely brilliant governance, also completely psychotic. Because behind the smiling patriarch act, the governor kept tanks full of severed heads in his apartment, just floating there while he sat in a chair and watched them. He kept his zombified daughter Penny locked in a closet, brushing her hair like she was still alive. He genuinely believed he was some kind of messiah, and that's the gap that makes him terrifying. He wasn't faking the confidence. He believed every word he said. He just also happened to be a cunning, manipulative, savage megalomaniac who viewed torture as a Tuesday. His war with Rick's prison group was never about security. He had Woodbury. It was fortified, stocked, functioning. The prison was a concrete nightmare by comparison. But the governor couldn't tolerate the existence of a community he didn't control. That's it. That's the whole thing. So he labeled Rick's people terrorists, sold the threat to Woodbury's militia, and manufactured a war out of nothing but ego. And then came the moment his mask cracked in front of everyone. Standing outside the prison with a tank and an army, he dragged Herschel to his knees and decapitated him with Michonne's katana, right there, in broad daylight, in front of both groups. It wasn't strategy anymore. It was spectacle addiction. He'd spent so long performing power that he forgot the performance was supposed to serve a purpose. His own soldiers watched an old man get beheaded and thought, wait, are we the bad guys? And when he ordered them to keep pushing a fight that was already lost, his own follower Lily put a bullet in his head. Woodbury didn't fall to walkers. It didn't fall to Rick. It was abandoned after the governor died because the entire thing had been held together by one man's delusion, and the second he was gone, there was nothing underneath. The fortified utopia wasn't destroyed by external enemies. It was destroyed by his pathological inability to accept that anything could exist outside his control. But if you think the governor took the concept of unhinged leadership to its logical extreme, you haven't met the woman who made him look like a city councilman. Here's the thing about Alpha. Most people assume she invented the Whisperers, that she woke up one day, skinned a walker, put it on her face, and said, "This is who we are now." Turns out, no. Alpha, Tales of the Walking Dead, quietly rewrote everything we thought we knew about this woman. Born D, she and her daughter Lydia stumbled onto a pre-existing group already wearing the dead. They were led by a woman named Hera, who knocked Alpha unconscious and absorbed her into the pack. Alpha didn't build this philosophy from scratch. She ate it alive. She challenged Hera, killed her, skinned her skull, and wore that woman's face as a mask for the rest of her life, which somehow makes her worse. Because if Alpha had dreamed this whole thing up herself, you could chalk it up to one person's psychotic break. But she found a functioning ideology, recognized its power, and perfected it into something infinitely more dangerous. She's not the inventor. She's the upgrade. And what an upgrade. The Whisperer philosophy isn't just be brutal. It's a complete replacement operating system for human civilization. The apocalypse didn't destroy the natural order. It restored it. Humans are animals. Names are pack designations, not identities. Walker skins aren't disguises, they're armor. Love is weakness. Strength is the only moral currency that matters. Every atrocity the Whisperers commit isn't cruelty for its own sake. It's doctrine. This extends to places most leaders won't go. Sexual violence within the group is normalized as natural occurrence. There is no protection. There is no justice. Alpha's regime isn't indifferent to suffering. It is philosophically committed to suffering as a purifying force. Every other villain in this show has lines they won't cross. Alpha erased the concept of lines entirely. Her tactical mind matched her ideology. She and Beta maintained Walker herds thousands strong, stored in a massive cave, ready to be unleashed on fortified settlements without firing a single bullet. She once personally walked Daryl to a cliff overlook just to show him the horde below. Not to attack, just to let that image burrow into his brain and never leave. That's not military strategy. That's psychological warfare at a level nobody in this show had encountered before. And then, the Pikes. Alpha infiltrated the Kingdom's fair, kidnapped attendees, and mounted their severed heads on border-marking pikes. Enid, Tara, Henry. This wasn't defense. This wasn't retaliation. This was a punitive territorial statement designed to shatter the Coalition's will to resist and to break Carol specifically. She picked Henry because she knew exactly what it would do. But here's the dark irony. Her death comes at the hands of Negan, the show's former ultimate villain. He lures her to a secluded area under the pretense of delivering Lydia for execution, then slits her throat and delivers the zombified head as proof. The man who beat Glenn to death with a baseball bat becomes the instrument of liberation from someone even worse. The franchise's sharpest moral inversion, played completely straight. Alpha proved that the most terrifying leader isn't the one with the biggest army. It's the one who builds a religion around the idea that your suffering is the point. But if Alpha abandoned civilization as a concept, the next leader tried to resurrect it, class system and all, and somehow made it just as horrifying. Every leader on this list built something new: a prison community, a kingdom, a cult, a protection racket. They took the apocalypse and shaped it into whatever nightmare or utopia they could imagine. Pamela Milton didn't do that. She just brought back the old world. And that's the scariest thing in the entire franchise. Pamela Milton. Pamela Milton was the governor of the Commonwealth, a network of roughly 50,000 survivors that makes every other settlement in the show look like a lemonade stand. Functioning military, economic markets, a legal system, sports games, galas. The Commonwealth wasn't some desperate camp behind a chain-link fence. It was a civilization, and Pamela ran it like her birthright, because in her mind, it was. Her father was a former president of the United States, so when she got elected governor, it didn't feel like democracy. It felt like inheritance. And here's where it gets insidious. The Commonwealth didn't look evil. That was the whole point. There were no arenas with chained walkers. Nobody was wearing a skin suit. Nobody got their skull caved in with a baseball bat at a campfire. Instead, there were job assignments based on what you did before the world ended. Doctors stayed doctors. Lawyers stayed lawyers. And if you were a janitor or a line cook before the dead started walking, congratulations. You're still a janitor. Your survival skills, your courage, your ability to keep people alive for years in the wasteland, none of that mattered. What mattered was your resume. Pamela hosted cocktail parties for the upper class while lower status citizens scraped by. She maintained a fixer named Lance Hornsby who handled the dirty work, so her hands stayed clean. The violence wasn't in the streets. It was in the structure. It was in who got medicine first, who got housing, who got listened to. And that's what made it so hard to fight. You can shoot a guy with a bat. You can't shoot a zoning policy, but every system cracks eventually. And when hers did, Pamela showed exactly who she was. Faced with exposure and a growing revolt, she made the single most damning decision any leader in this franchise has ever made. She planned to sacrifice the Commonwealth's lower-class citizens to a walker horde, use them as a human shield so the elites could survive. Not as collateral damage, not as an accident, as a strategy. In her calculus, those people weren't citizens. They were a resource to be spent. The body count tells its own story. Roman Calhoun, Tyler Davis, Jules Butler, Luke Abrams, Adrienne, Rosita Espinosa, at least 15 Commonwealth soldiers, 3 prisoners, and others, all casualties of a system built on plausible deniability, maintained by bureaucracy, and defended with the quiet cruelty of someone who genuinely believed some lives were worth more than others. And then comes the ending that makes her the most important entry on this entire list. Every other tyrant we've covered died violently. The governor got a bullet, Alpha got her throat slit, Negan got his skull cracked open and barely survived, Shane got stabbed by his best friend in a field. That's the pattern. You become a monster, you die like one. But Pamela didn't get that. When the coalition finally brought her down, she tried to take her own life, and they stopped her. They put her on trial, they convicted her, and they locked her in a cell for the rest of her natural life. No execution, no dramatic last stand, just a courtroom, a verdict, and a prison sentence. Pamela Milton is the most chilling leader on this list because she requires zero imagination. No walker herds, no skin masks, no post-apocalyptic warlord theatrics, just a class system, a smile, and the absolute certainty that some people matter more than others. We didn't need a zombie apocalypse to invent that. We've been living with it the whole time. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now